Welcome to It Pays to Fear God. My name is Ewaenruwa Nomaren, and let's get into the topic for today, which is captioned, Is God Sufficient for You? As technology develops and people gradually become more and more secular, and the things of the world become more and more abundant, people just don't feel like God is very sufficient for their lives anymore. Because the way God has seen the world and what we need in order to survive has never really changed because he doesn't change from his principles. If you read Malachi chapter 3 verse 6, but as the world changes, then so do the standards in the world change, and so do our tastes, our covetousness, our lust, so do those change as well. And when God can't really keep up with them anymore, which essentially means when we start veering out of God's boundaries, then as God doesn't seem to be providing what we want and need, then it seems like God isn't sufficient for us. But what I want to talk about in this video is the fact that God is sufficient, and the reason why he might not be seeming so may not be for the reason that we might think. But before I really get into any of the details for this subject, I just want to throw a question at you that you can answer in the comment section below. It is not a question related to this subject, but it's an engaging one that does talk about events in the Old Testament. And that question is, why did God show so much mercy to the Israelites even when they completely disregarded his principles? If you read Exodus chapter 32, you see an example of when they did so. So why did God still show so much mercy to him? Try to use as many Bible quotations as you want, and just throw it in the comment section below because it might engage some interesting discussions. Anyway, back to the subject, is God sufficient for you? So let's dive more into this growing feeling that God isn't sufficient. Now, to understand this, it's good that we look at the Old Testament, because though this feeling is really only growing universally in our time, it is precedent. It has happened before. The Israelites had felt that God just wasn't really sufficient for their lives, in the wilderness especially, because that was when, times were tough and then those feelings started to develop. If we look at Exodus chapter 16 from verses 1 to 12, for example, you can see that they compared what they were having at the moment with what they used to have. The life that they were living in Egypt, how they used to have bread to the fullest and garlic and generally more healthy and good variety than just the light bread, the manna that they were eating continuously, morning, day, night. There was really nothing else that they were eating. They were like, we should have just stayed there, and if the Egyptians wanted to kill us, let them do that, because that life is just so much better. They didn't feel that what God was giving to them was enough for their lives. What they didn't realize, though, was that there were a lot of fantastic things that God had done for them. If you look at what God did with Pharaoh in Exodus chapters 7 to 12, you can see that the Israelites couldn't have imagined bringing themselves together to do that. They were just slaves. They had no power. And that was why, if you read Jeremiah chapter 15, verses 33 and 34, that event was described. The pharaohs and generally the leaders and the princes of Egypt, they held everyone fast. They could not go no matter how much they wanted to. And that was why it was described as bondage in Exodus chapter 2 from verses 23 to 25. And God volunteered to free them, if you read Exodus chapter 3 verse 8, because he felt sorry for them and he felt that he could bring them to himself. If you read Exodus chapter 19 from verses 4 to 6 and Ezekiel chapter 16 from verses 8 to 63. That should have been sufficient for the Israelites, because that should have built hope in them. They would go to Canaan where they would have all the kinds of food that they want, and the journey wouldn't take that long. However, because they were comparing what God never gave them to what they got from the Egyptians, who, by the way, were not children of God, that was what made God not sufficient. I want you to remember this point. The reason why God might not seem sufficient for you is not because God isn't giving enough, but it's probably because You are looking at what you haven't gotten from God, and you're comparing that with what you have gotten from God. And usually, what ends up happening is that what you haven't gotten is of the world. And the things of the world, because they seem to resonate more with us, you will like that better, and therefore, what God has already given you doesn't seem like a lot. It seems small, it seems insufficient, and then what you haven't gotten from the world is now what will make your life better. It's the concepts that will help you understand everything else that I'm going to say in this video. And it wasn't just in that Exodus chapter 16 that the Israelites felt this way. If you also look at Numbers chapter 14, they even wanted to reverse, jeopardize God's plan by going back to the land of Egypt. God was so insufficient for them that they couldn't even bear it anymore. They just wanted to return. The Egyptians do whatever they want with them, and they just forget about that part of their lives. But once again, it was not because God wasn't giving them enough, because what he was doing for them was amazing, in fact. And if you look at Exodus chapter 15, they were praising him for all that, but it was because they were comparing what they had with the Egyptians that that entire plan didn't seem sufficient. If you also look at 1 Samuel chapter 8 from verses 1 to 8, way later than this event that I have just described, you can still see that they didn't see God as sufficient for them. There was a system that was currently ruling with the judges and everything, and God approved that system. But they felt that that system wasn't good for them. And instead of consulting God, they just decided to consult themselves, decide that we need a king just like the other Gentile nations, and then they brought Samuel to come and decide who that king should be. What makes God insufficient for them in this case is that they didn't really feel content with what God was already doing, and they didn't bother bringing the case to God. They felt that God was not able to solve this issue. God wasn't capable of giving them what they wanted, and it was what the Gentiles were doing, the nations, the kings, the dynasties, whatever was going on there, that would make their lives better. And if you read many places, Jeremiah chapter 2, Ezekiel chapter 16, Lamentations chapter 3, and many other places, especially the sayings of the prophets, that was where you could see how God saw what they did. They abandoned him. They went to other gods with flagons of wine. They abandoned God because they didn't think that he was sufficient for them. This is essentially what is going on in our time. As things have become more abundant, many versions of everything exist now. People are now going for that. Surfeiting and covetousness is now boiling inside of everyone's hearts. And because of that, when God doesn't catch up with their needs, as in like when new cars are created, new houses are made, and God doesn't provide them with the resources to keep up with the world, then God doesn't seem sufficient any longer. However, there were many people who described God as sufficient, especially David in the Psalms. Because if you look at the statements he made there, he described God as his portion, as his shield, as his high tower, as his buckler, the horn of his salvation, and so on and so forth. Those are things that make that thing sufficient for you. When one particular entity is all of those things to you, then that thing is sufficient. And to people like David, God was that one thing. For example, if we read Psalm chapter 16 verse 5, David told us, "The Lord is the portion of mine inheritance and of my cup. Thou maintainest my lot." In Psalm chapter 142 verse 5, we also see something similar. "I cried unto thee, O Lord, and said, Thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living." And in Psalm chapter 62 from verses 5 to 7, he made it specific by saying that it's not just that God is my salvation and God is my refuge. He is my only refuge, meaning that he didn't go to other gods and other nations to seek for the same things. And there he told us, "My soul, wait thou only upon God, for mine expectation is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense, I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. That is what Psalms chapter 62 from verses 5 to 7 says. And if you also read Psalms chapter 119 verse 57 and many other places in the Psalms, we can see that opinion expressed. And to understand this, we can actually look at examples of people who God was sufficient for based on what he had done for them. Look at Abraham. If you look at Genesis chapter 15 verse 1, God told him that he was going to be his happiness, his reward essentially. And Abraham trusted God that he would be sufficient for him. He didn't look to other nations to try to build that for himself, to get a child and multiply and fill the earth and so on. No, he trusted God. And that was why in Genesis chapter 22 verse 8 and verse 7, Isaac had asked him where was the lamb for the sacrifice going to be. Abraham just told him God will provide. When we trust that God will provide everything that we need, then God is sufficient for us. And that was why St. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4 verse 19 that God will supply all our needs, because that is exactly what he does. If you also look at St. Paul in Philippians chapter 3 from verses 7 to 9, he was describing how God satisfied him, and the fact that he won over Jesus Christ himself is already enough for him. He could forsake all his old ways just to win Jesus Christ over to himself. That satisfied him. That gave him joy and peace. Why? Because Jesus Christ, God, the things that they were doing, that was sufficient for himself and his happiness. We have to see God in that light if God is to be sufficient for us. Otherwise, if we're just comparing what he's giving us with what we're not getting, which the world can provide, then, well, of course, you know what's going to happen. God will no more be sufficient for our lives. Now, let's actually take this to the practical world. Let's see how God can be sufficient for our lives in our time. There are certain problems that the world can't solve for you based on the fact that, for example, divorce rates are increasing. The inability for parents to raise their children properly is growing, and so on and so forth. Those are not problems that the world can solve because no matter what governments try to do, they don't have a solution. Ultimately, those rates just keep going up. But God has the ability to fix our marriage if it's about to fall off the cliff, and so on and so forth. Then, to really drive this point home, it's good that we compare two kings in the Bible who suffered the same thing. And we can see that one, God was sufficient for, the other, God was not sufficient for. Let's start off with King Ahaziah in 2 Kings chapter 1, the king who God was not sufficient for. He fell through a lattice and then he became sick. He had a disease and he wasn't sure whether he was going to recover from it. But instead of going to God to find that out, he sent messengers to the god of Ekron, to Beelzebub, to see if he would survive. People would usually go to God because the God of Israel was God Almighty. Read Genesis chapter 17 verse 1 and all that. But he wanted to go to a different God. And then Elijah intercepted them and said, hey, just return to the king and tell him that because you have decided to ignore God, because God wasn't sufficient for you, you will not get up from that bed which you are currently lying on. Essentially, he would die. And then you can see that that is what ended up happening. However, if you look at King Hezekiah in Isaiah chapter 38, when he was also sick and it was clear that he was going to die from a message of Isaiah the prophet, he didn't go consult Beelzebub or Baal or any other god. He just went to God Almighty and cried before him and said, hey, look, I'm perfect. I don't see what I would have done that would allow me to have to go through all this. I don't see why I have to die so young. And then after he prayed to God and all that, Isaiah the prophet was sent back to him, and then he was given 15 more years of life. You can see that King Hezekiah was rewarded with that because God was sufficient for him. But King Ahaziah had to die with his sickness because he decided to consult another god. Therefore, it is clear from these examples that when we trust in God, when God is sufficient for us, life in the end does get better. Let's look at what David went through in 2 Samuel chapters 15 to 18. Now, I already explained the kind of statements that David made, like in Psalm chapter 62 from verses 5 to 7 once again. Those statements were only made by David because of experiences like that, which I'm going to explain right now. Essentially, if we read 2 Samuel chapters 14 and 15, Absalom was trying to take over the kingdom, and Ahithophel, which was David's personal counselor, was now on Absalom's side. And obviously, when your personal counselor who you trusted is now on the other side, it gets a kind of worried, doesn't it? So, because of that, David prayed to God that he would destroy the counsel of Ahithophel. Now, it was quite a hefty prayer because remember, David was already losing out. There was almost no hope of him returning to his kingship because everything, all the odds were against him, as people say. But he still trusted God. God was sufficient for him, which is why he prayed to God that he would destroy that counsel. So, in order for God to do this, he brought Hushai, who was another person David knew in person, to counter the advice of Ahithophel. Ahithophel's advice was actually something that would kill David, almost guaranteed, coming after him and slaughtering him and so on. But Hushai decided that why don't we bring the whole nation, like the entire army, then we go looking out for him, and then if we locate him in a city, then we rope the whole city together and so on, and we do whatever we can to find him. And God made sure that Absalom preferred that advice. And if we read 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 14, God did so that Absalom could be killed. And if you read the story afterwards, you can see that Absalom took Hushai's advice, and then he was killed because his hair got tangled in a tree and then he was stabbed. That is what happens to people such as David who trust in God, who God is sufficient for. Another example is the story of Daniel in Daniel chapter 2. Essentially, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, except when he woke up, he couldn't remember what that dream was. He asked his astrologers and his monthly prognosticators and those people who were qualified to, interpret dreams and so on. He tried to tell them, I don't remember my dream, but if you can tell me, you will be rewarded heavily. Except, because they weren't divine, they couldn't. They were like, this just isn't possible. And then he threatened to kill all the wise men in the entire kingdom. Daniel was obviously one of such men, and he didn't want to die. So he prayed to God earnestly with his 3 companions so that God could reveal the dream. And then he did. He revealed the dream, and then Daniel was able to interpret it, and then Daniel was elevated to one of the highest positions in the entire kingdom. Daniel's life was at risk because he could have died. He could have been killed by King Nebuchadnezzar. But because God was sufficient for Daniel, he solved that problem for him. So, let's actually get into how we make God sufficient for our lives. If we are currently in a situation where we don't think God is sufficient, how can we transform our hearts, renew our minds so that we start thinking according to God being sufficient for us? Well, one way is to stop looking at what God hasn't given us, what God hasn't done for us, and look more into what we can gain from God, what God has provided that is very beneficial to our lives. Let's take God's wisdom and knowledge, for example. When we get the wisdom of God and find the wisdom of God, God will be sufficient for our lives because that is more precious than fine gold or whatever it is we might be seeking in our lives in this world. If we read Proverbs chapter 3 and verses 13 and 14, King Solomon told us, "Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold." And there are many other places in Proverbs that talk about this as well. Proverbs chapter 2 from verses 1 to 6, chapter 8 and verses 10 and 11, chapter 16 verse 6, and so on and so forth. The wisdom of God is a very precious thing, and when we have it, we don't need the wisdom of the world in order to also be filled. We don't need to be educated to the highest degree. No, God will be sufficient in our lives when we have stuff like the wisdom of God. Same goes with God's mercy and loving kindness. David talked a lot about how it was satisfying. Psalms chapter 36 from verses 7 to 9, Isaiah chapter 63 verse 7, and many other places all over the Bible. Then another thing that we should do is trust in God. We should trust that God has the ability to take care of our problems, and that we stop worrying about it. Stop being anxious. If we read Philippians chapter 4 verse 6. And if we look at Isaiah chapter 26 from verses 2 to 4, in a more prophetic light, it talks about what happens to people who trust in God, who believe in God's salvation. And there Isaiah the prophet told us, Open ye the gates, that the righteous nation, which keepeth the truth may enter in. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. Trust ye in the Lord forever, for in the Lord Jehovah is everlasting strength. It talks about a lot of things, but one of the things that it talks about is how those who trust in God will rely on God's everlasting strength, and when they do, God will be sufficient for them. To conclude this whole discussion, I just want to look at what St. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5, because yes, it does summarize everything that has been said in this video. And there he told us, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. I hope that what I have said in this video can help you understand that when we want to detach from God, when we want to cut the umbilical cord that connects us with God, then, well, we're not really doing much good for our lives, because we're going to see that certain problems that we'll have, the solution remains with God. But when we stick with God, when we dwell in His estate, as we've preached in one of our other videos, dwelling in God's estate, when we trust in Him and be happy with what He's given us, then He will be sufficient for our lives, and the problems that we have, He will take care of them for us, and therefore our lives will be filled with peace and happiness. And that is where I want to stop on discussing that subject. Is God sufficient for you? I hope that you have enjoyed this video and come to understand what it means for God to be sufficient for us. And I also hope that you have come to see maybe why God hasn't been seen as very satisfying for you for reasons that I explained earlier. The most important thing I want you to take from this video is already what I've emphasized, and it's the fact that the only reason why God doesn't seem sufficient for us is just because we are looking at what He doesn't give. If we constrain ourselves within what He has decided to give us, then all of a sudden life will become amazing, and generally we will live happier and more peaceful lives. Have a great day.